Tensions between the American colonies and Britain had been building for years, but by the 1760s, the cracks were beginning to show in a big way. The British Empire, facing mounting debts from their various wars, especially the costly 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War in North America, looked to the colonies as a potential source of revenue. The problem was that the colonies didn't feel they should be taxed by a government they had no direct influence over. This marked the beginning of a series of events that would eventually spiral into the American Revolution. It all started with the Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a direct tax on all printed materials in the colonies, including newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. The British saw this as a reasonable way to fund the war debt and maintain British troops in North America, but the colonists were furious. The cry, "No taxation without representation," echoed across the colonies. They argued that it was unjust to tax them without granting them a voice in Parliament. Many colonists believed they should have the right to govern themselves, especially since they were so far from Britain and had no direct representation in the British government. The reaction to the Stamp Act was swift and furious. The colonies organized boycotts of British goods, and the British government quickly found itself facing resistance on a scale it had never expected. In 1766, facing immense pressure, Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but this wasn't the end of the tension. Britain wasn't about to let the colonies get away with defying them, so they passed the Townshend Acts in 1767, which imposed taxes on imported goods like paper, glass, and tea. This was yet another blow to the colonies, who felt the taxes were still oppressive and without proper representation. The colonists responded again, organizing more boycotts of British goods and using their influence to stir up public sentiment against the British. Things began to escalate further, especially with the Boston Massacre of 1770. British soldiers stationed in Boston were viewed as an occupying force, and tensions between the soldiers and colonists were high. One night, a confrontation between a group of colonists and British soldiers turned deadly. British troops opened fire on the crowd, killing 5 colonists. This event was widely publicized by colonial leaders, with figures like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams using the incident as propaganda to fuel anti-British sentiment. To the colonists, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was evidence of British tyranny. The situation continued to worsen with the Tea Act of 1773. This act was passed by the British to help the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the American colonies, bypassing colonial merchants. The intention was to lower the cost of tea in the colonies, but the colonists saw it as another attempt by Britain to control their trade and undermine colonial businesses. The Boston Tea Party, which occurred later that year, was the ultimate act of defiance. A group of colonists, led by the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Native Americans and boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor, which was worth an enormous sum of money. This bold and dramatic protest was a direct challenge to British authority and would set the stage for even greater conflict. The British response to the Boston Tea Party was harsh. They passed a series of laws, known as the Coercive Acts or Intolerable Acts in 1774, aimed at punishing the colonies, especially Massachusetts. These acts closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, limited the power of local governments, and allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. This was a significant blow to colonial self-government and fueled the fire of resentment even further. In response to these acts, the colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September 1774. Representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, Georgia was absent, gathered to discuss a unified response to Britain's increasing aggression. They agreed to boycott British goods, set up committees of correspondence to keep the colonies in communication, and prepared for the possibility of armed conflict. While they still hoped for reconciliation with Britain, it was clear that tensions were reaching a breaking point. By the spring of 1775, the situation had become even more volatile. The British were aware of growing unrest in the colonies and began to take military precautions. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, sent troops to seize colonial arms and ammunition stored in Concord, Massachusetts. However, Colonial spies had already caught wind of the plan, and word spread like wildfire. The famous midnight ride of Paul Revere and William Dawes warned the militia, and the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, marked the first armed confrontation between the British and the colonial militias. Though the British soldiers technically won the battle at Lexington, the militia was able to force them to retreat from Concord, marking the beginning of the Revolutionary War. The battles at Lexington and Concord were a pivotal moment. They signified that diplomacy had failed and that war was now inevitable. What followed were months of skirmishes and standoffs as the British and colonial forces clashed across New England. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened, and in response to the outbreak of hostilities, they took the step of organizing the Continental Army, naming George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington, a respected military leader from Virginia, would soon take charge of the increasingly desperate and ragtag colonial forces. Looking back, it's easy to see how a combination of British miscalculations and colonial resentment sparked the conflict. The British misjudged the extent of colonial frustration and underestimated the desire for independence. Meanwhile, the colonies, through years of growing economic control, propaganda, and resistance, were developing a sense of unity and identity. Many of the colonists, especially in the New England colonies, felt they were being treated as second-class citizens by Britain. The ongoing economic burden, along with the constant meddling in local affairs, made the colonists increasingly determined to break free from British control. The events of the early 1770s, including the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, and the Boston Tea Party, set the stage for an inevitable conflict. These were not isolated incidents, but rather part of a larger struggle over political and economic control. The British may have thought they could maintain their dominance over the colonies through taxes and regulations, but they underestimated the resolve of the American people to govern themselves. What began as a series of protests over taxes and trade regulations would soon evolve into a fight for independence, changing the course of history forever. The outbreak of the American Revolution marked the beginning of a long and grueling war, one that would test the resolve of the fledgling Continental Army and its leadership. In April 1775, the battles of Lexington and Concord set the stage for the conflict, but the war itself was far from straightforward. It was a battle for independence against one of the world's most powerful empires, and the odds were heavily stacked against the Americans. However, through determination, foreign alliances, and a series of key victories, the Continental Army was able to keep the revolution alive and eventually force Britain into submission. At the outset of the war, the Continental Army was far from the well-organized and equipped force needed to take on the British military. The British Army, professional and well-supplied, had been at war for years, fighting battles all over the world. In contrast, the Continental Army was a collection of militias, with soldiers who were often poorly trained, ill-equipped, and inexperienced. Despite these challenges, the Americans had one advantage. They were fighting on their own soil, with a cause they deeply believed in. Many colonists saw this as a fight for their very survival, for the chance to create a nation where they could govern themselves. In June 1775, just a few months after the conflict began, one of the war's earliest and most symbolic battles took place, the Battle of Bunker Hill. While technically a British victory, it was a costly one. The British troops, under General William Howe, suffered heavy casualties, including many officers. The Americans, led by militia commanders like Israel Putnam and William Prescott, had managed to put up a strong resistance despite being poorly trained and undersupplied. The battle proved that the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with the British, even if they were outmatched in terms of experience and resources. It also gave the American cause a huge boost in morale. The early stages of the war were characterized by a series of small skirmishes and larger battles, with neither side achieving a decisive victory. Washington's leadership, however, was crucial in keeping the Continental Army intact. Appointed commander-in-chief by the Second Continental Congress, George Washington was no stranger to military leadership, having served in the French and Indian War. Though he didn't have the experience of seasoned generals like the British commanders, Washington quickly proved himself to be a capable strategist and leader, inspiring his troops and keeping them motivated despite the hardships they faced. One of the most significant turning points in the war came in 1776. The British, under the command of General Howe, had occupied New York City and were making steady progress. Washington's army, meanwhile, had suffered numerous defeats and was retreating across New Jersey. By the end of 1776, it seemed like the American cause might be doomed. But Washington, in an audacious move, launched a surprise attack on the Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas night. The victory at Trenton was not just a military success, it was a morale booster for the American forces, who had been demoralized after a string of defeats. Encouraged by this victory, Washington struck again in the following days, defeating the British forces at the Battle of Princeton. These victories, though small in scale, were incredibly important. They gave the Continental Army a much-needed boost in confidence and sent a clear message to both the British and the American public that the war was far from over. Washington's ability to keep the revolution alive, despite overwhelming odds, cemented his reputation as a capable and inspirational leader. While the Continental Army was making some gains in the Northeast, the British were still focused on crushing the rebellion by targeting key cities and strongholds. The British strategy involved trying to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, hoping to isolate the rebellious region and force the other colonies to surrender. But the Americans, aided by the French, were able to turn the tide in a major way in 1777. The Battle of Saratoga, fought in upstate New York, was a pivotal moment in the war. In a stunning victory, American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold managed to defeat the British forces, led by General John Burgoyne. The victory at Saratoga was significant not only because of the military success, but because it convinced France that the American cause was worth supporting. France had been sympathetic to the American cause since the beginning of the war, but the French government had been cautious about committing troops and resources to a war that seemed unlikely to succeed. Saratoga, however, convinced the French that the Americans had a real chance of winning, and in 1778, France officially entered the war as an ally of the United States. French support was a game-changer for the Americans. French military aid, including troops, naval support, and supplies, helped tip the balance of power in favor of the Continental Army. The French also brought critical naval strength to the fight, which proved invaluable during the decisive Battle of Yorktown in 1781. By 1781, the British forces, led by General Cornwallis, had become overextended. The British had been unable to put down the rebellion in the American colonies, and their attempts to squash the revolution were becoming increasingly desperate. Cornwallis, stationed in Yorktown, Virginia, thought he could hold out and wait for reinforcements from the British Navy. But the Americans, with the help of the French, managed to trap Cornwallis's army. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, blocked British ships from reaching the shore, while American and French forces, led by Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau, laid siege to the British positions at Yorktown. The British forces were surrounded, and after several weeks of intense fighting, Cornwallis was forced to surrender on October 19, 1781. The surrender at Yorktown effectively ended the fighting in North America, though peace negotiations would drag on for another 2 years. The British, exhausted by years of war and facing mounting pressure at home, were ready to negotiate a peace settlement. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, officially recognizing the United States as an independent nation. The Americans had won the war, but the cost had been high. Thousands of soldiers had died from combat, disease, and harsh conditions, and the economy had been severely strained. Yet, the victory at Yorktown and the eventual peace settlement marked the birth of a new nation, one founded on the principles of liberty, self-governance, and independence. The American Revolution was not just a series of military engagements. It was a test of will, resilience, and the ability to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, fought not only for independence, but for the right to shape their own destiny. With crucial victories like Trenton, Princeton, Saratoga, and Yorktown, the Americans proved that they were capable of standing up to the might of the British Empire. And with the support of their French allies, They turned the tide of history in their favor, forever changing the future of the American colonies and the world. The victory at Yorktown in 1781 was a monumental moment in the American Revolution, signaling the end of active military operations in the colonies. However, winning the war was only the beginning of the struggle for the new United States. With independence achieved, the next challenge was to create a government that could hold the young nation together and establish a stable framework for governance. But the road ahead was anything but smooth. The newfound freedom brought with it a myriad of issues: economic instability, internal divisions, and the lack of a unified government that required immediate attention. After the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war in 1783, the United States found itself facing a host of daunting problems. One of the most immediate challenges was how to create a government that could manage the vast territory the new nation had acquired. The states had long been accustomed to their own autonomy and independence, and many feared a strong central government would threaten their newfound freedoms. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, had been intended as a framework to unite the 13 states, but in practice, it proved to be weak and ineffective. Under the Articles, the federal government had very limited power. It couldn't tax, regulate trade, or raise an army without the approval of the states, which often didn't come. As a result, the government was unable to address many of the nation's most pressing issues. Economic problems were among the first to surface. The war had left the United States deeply in debt, and the Articles of Confederation offered no real way for the federal government to raise money. The national economy was in disarray, and the states were each pursuing their own economic interests, often at odds with one another. States imposed tariffs on each other's goods, creating barriers to trade within the nation. This lack of a unified economic policy made it difficult for the young nation to recover from the economic strains of the Revolutionary War. At the same time, many of the states had issued paper money during the war to finance military efforts, but this currency was now worthless. With no central bank or unified currency, the country faced a severe lack of financial stability. Inflation was rampant, and the value of money fluctuated wildly. The inability to stabilize the economy led to widespread discontent, and many Americans began to question whether the Articles of Confederation were sufficient for maintaining order and ensuring the country's survival. The lack of a strong federal government also led to internal divisions. The Articles of Confederation created a system where each state had one vote in the unicameral legislature, regardless of its size or population. This created tension between larger states, which felt underrepresented, and smaller states, which feared being overpowered. The lack of a central executive also meant there was no one person who could enforce laws or lead the country in times of crisis. The absence of a unified approach to governing the nation left the states to deal with their own internal issues, and in some cases, this led to conflict. One of the most significant internal challenges came in 1786, when the country experienced a rebellion that exposed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, Shays Rebellion. In Massachusetts, farmers who were struggling with debt and high taxes, many of them former soldiers who had not been compensated for their service in the war, took up arms in protest. The rebellion was crushed, but it was a clear sign that the government was ill-equipped to deal with civil unrest or protect the citizens of a new nation. The event sent shockwaves through the country, prompting many to rethink the structure of the government. By 1787, it was clear that the Articles of Confederation were not working. A constitutional convention was called in Philadelphia to address the nation's problems. Initially, the goal was simply to amend the Articles, but it quickly became apparent that a complete overhaul was necessary. Delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island being the exception, gathered in secret to draft a new framework for government. Among the delegates were some of the brightest minds of the era, including George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. The challenge they faced was how to create a government that balanced the needs for a strong central authority with the preservation of states' rights. The resulting document, the United States Constitution, was a compromise in many respects. It established a strong central government with a system of checks and balances between three branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The presidency was created as the head of the executive branch, and the system of electing representatives to the legislative branch was designed to ensure that both small and large states had a say in the laws that govern them. The Constitution also granted the federal government the power to tax, regulate trade, and maintain a standing army, powers that the Articles of Confederation had denied. However, the Constitution was not without its critics. Many feared that a stronger federal government would trample on the rights of the states and individual citizens. To address these concerns, the Federalists, led by figures like Hamilton and Madison, promised that a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution to protect individual freedoms. These first 10 amendments, ratified in 1791, included fundamental rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the right to a fair trial. With the addition of the Bill of Rights, the Constitution gained widespread support, and the new government began to take shape. But even with the Constitution in place, the new nation faced significant challenges. The country was still dealing with the economic fallout from the war, and the federal government had to find ways to stabilize the economy. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, played a key role in this effort. He implemented a series of financial reforms, including the establishment of a national bank, the assumption of state debts by the federal government, and the creation of a system of tariffs. Hamilton's financial policies were designed to create a strong national economy and ensure that the federal government had the resources it needed to function effectively. Despite these efforts, the United States still faced problems with foreign relations. The country's relationship with Britain remained strained, and the British continued to occupy forts in the Western Territories, violating the Treaty of Paris. Tensions also existed with Spain, particularly over control of the Mississippi River and the territory of Florida. Additionally, relations with Native American tribes were difficult, as the United States expanded westward and clashed with indigenous groups who had previously been allied with the British. These foreign issues required careful diplomacy, and the United States would continue to face external challenges throughout its early years. Internally, the country struggled with issues of slavery, which remained a deeply divisive issue. While the northern states gradually moved toward abolishing slavery, it remained entrenched in the southern states, where it was an integral part of the economy. The question of whether new states would permit slavery created tensions that would come to a head in later decades, eventually leading to the Civil War.